very warm good evening to all of you. I would like to take this opportunity to share our heartfelt gratitude on behalf of Krea University for joining us today for the book launch of Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future by Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Governing Council Member of Krea University, and Katherine Dusak Miller, Distinguished Service Professor of Finance, University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, and Dr. Rohit Lamba, Assistant Professor of Economics, Pennsylvania State University. It's a busy, cloudy Saturday evening in Chennai, but despite this, you all could make it. Thank you very much for gracing this occasion with your presence. We are sure this evening will be etched in our memories for a long time to come. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Lakshmi Narayanan, the Chancellor of Krea University, to please deliver the welcome address.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me add my welcome to all of you. I do want to acknowledge the presence of certain important people in Chennai, starting with our Honorable Minister, Mr. Rajan. He likes to introduce himself as Tyagu, so for most of us here, he'll be Tyagu. Mr. Ram is here, and many other people who are friends of Krea University and friends of the ecosystem here in Chennai are present here. Welcome to this event. I'll just quickly go through some introduction on behalf of Krea University. This is an opportunity for me to pitch Krea. I'll do that, and then we'll get going with the program. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future by Dr. Raghuram Rajan and Dr. Lamba. I'd specifically, on particular, extend a warm welcome to Dr. Lamba, who's probably been here not very many occasions, while Dr. Raghuram Rajan is quite familiar with this place. While many of us are familiar with Dr. Rajan, I'm greatly honored to invite Dr. Lamba, an economist from Penn State University, a PhD from Princeton. He's an economic theorist with interest in policy-related topics, and his interests are, among others, Himalayan trekking. He's been to Kashmir, Ladakh, Himachal, Bhutan, and many hills and trekking that he has done there. Welcome. Since the establishment of Krea in 2018, Dr. Rajan has been instrumental in setting its direction and contributing to the university's growth and development. In the complex world that we live in, that no longer works in silos, Dr. Rajan is a firm believer in cross-disciplinary understanding, where holistic education enables young minds to embark on their journeys to become thinkers and change makers. When the idea of Krea took birth, it was with the intention to build a safe space to learn and to grow. A space where learning would be immersive, ideas debated, and minds enriched to step into an unpredictable world, imparting knowledge steeped in innovation that would address issues of global concern, including scientific, cultural, environmental, and social. That's been the core of Krea's mission. We believe that the focus of learning needs to emphasize attributes like curiosity, critical thinking, and innovation, which is what Krea has set out to do, which is something that one of our founders, the sponsors, Mr. Seshes Shai, always emphasizes. Dr. Rajan and Dr. Lamba explore many ideas and issues in their book, Breaking the Mould. They write about investing in our people's intellectual capital, opening opportunities and high-skilled services, and fueling innovation with the aim to make India a hub of ideas and creativity. With India demonstrating an ambition to lead the world in sustainable economic growth, Dr. Rajan and Lamba's work sets out options, possibilities, and opportunities for the country's economy. This critical and timely study sheds light on India's economic future, our nation's own distinct space in the global economy, the future of employment, and an innovative way forward. To take us through this evening, Mr. Jude Sanith, Assistant Editor of CNBC TV 18, is here with us. He is no stranger to us. In fact, we owe a special thanks to Jude for anchoring many of similar programs on behalf of Chennai International Center whose CEO Chandramalu is also among the audience here today. So on behalf of Krea and all of you present here, let me welcome Dr. Rajan, Dr. Lamba, and Mr. Jude Sanith to take over the proceedings. Thank you very much and welcome once again.
All right, good evening everybody and gentlemen. It's great to have you here to discuss what is no doubt, at least I felt it was, quite an invigorating read, something that most of us need to speak a little bit more about, given the fact that manufacturing, industry, and just India's economic future is probably a hot topic on everybody's mind, especially in the recent past, especially given the focus on so many initiatives surrounding manufacturing, making in India for the world, if you will, and branches thereof. So on that note, Professor Rajan, Professor Lamba, I must say, on behalf of Krea and everybody here, it is an absolute pleasure to meet you both gentlemen and to be able to have this conversation with you. Before we begin, I can't quite help but wonder if most of you in the audience have read the book. I happened to read it a couple of days ago. I caught the audiobook, so I don't know if that is strictly speaking reading it, but we'll roll with that for now. But Dr. Rajan, let me start by putting the first question to you. What fascinated me really about the book was the introduction. And I think it's a great place to start, given that you begin at the very start itself. India and China. You've juxtaposed both these countries with each other, and you draw a very interesting parallel and contrast between both these countries, manufacturing giants, yes, but one with a significant head start over the other. And you say India can't quite, or India shouldn't try catching up because there's so much more that this country can do, as opposed to being merely a Me Too country or a Me Too economy when it comes to manufacturing. For the benefit of our audience, could you break that down and explain to us as to why there's so much more that India can do, as opposed to merely being an industrial heavyweight?
Right. Great place to start. Let me also start by thanking Krea for making this possible. Look, the earlier pathway for growth, which every East Asian country followed, which China also followed, was start with low-skilled manufacturing, assembly for the most part, import the components, and then as you grow richer, as your workers become more skilled, move up the value chain, move up to higher skilled manufacturing. And what gave them the ability to do that was a couple of things. First, that the more experienced Asian economies moved to other areas, leaving space for the low-skilled assembly, because their workers became better paid, etc., and just it didn't make sense for them to do this anymore. And a lot of the competition was with workers in industrial countries.
Right.
The China effect in the US, which has been talked about for some time now, that it led to Trump, because what it did was decimated the factories in the US. Well, that happens once. And that happens because factories in the US with high-paid workers are competing with factories in China with moderately paid workers. There were a number of other things that China had going for it. Communism results in much better education.
Right. You mentioned that as well in the book.
Much better than even a democracy like ours. If you compare the levels of education, China and India were at same per capita GDP till the 60s, 70s. But China was always better educated than India.
Right.
They invested much more in their people in that sense. So, bunch of differences, and add to that the fact that they have a authoritarian structure. If they want to build a railroad, they can acquire all the land they need. We have to deal with a democratic situation where it's hard to acquire land at the same pace. Put all that together. The timing, the fact that they were competing with the West, the fact that they could do a lot of things we couldn't, and they just moved ahead. They surged ahead. When we are trying to get into the game today, right, we have a number of problems. One, we are a democracy. We can't sort of acquire land or reduce labor rights. We can't suppress wage determination by the unions. We can't tell the unions you can't ask for higher wages. We can't do any of those things that the Chinese did. But there are a couple of important differences also. One, China's there in front of us, blocking our way. The Chinese haven't moved on.
Right.
We are still competing with China for low-end manufacturing.
Right.
And the rents are not the rents of competing with US workers.
Right.
It's competing with low-paid Chinese workers, low-paid Vietnamese workers. This is a low-end business now.
Absolutely.
The other thing that is problematic is the West has wised up to China. And now you hear talk of nearshoring, reshoring, onshoring, with automation taking the place of the cheap worker. In that environment, to try and be like another China is essentially not learning the lesson of what China is learning right now. This path has very little heft anymore. It doesn't lead anywhere positive. We have to find another path. So what we're saying is, let's take that lesson today and say, okay, yeah, if manufacturing comes, great. We're not against manufacturing. And there are certain kinds of Indian manufacturing which have worked very, very well. Look at the ancillary industry around Chennai. Look at the two-wheeler industry. A lot of manufacturing jugaad, where our engineering plays a role, works well. But that low-skilled assembly, trying to capture that right now, if we're going to get it, great. If we have to pay to get it, which is the way we seem to be going, maybe not so good.
In fact, on the topic of payment, you make mention of the Micron example in Gujarat and how essentially they were paying a whole lot of money for 5,000 odd jobs. And I think for most of you who may have read the book, one part that really resonates with me at this moment is the smile curve. You make mention of that as well in terms of how the greatest value can be seen at the beginning of the smile and at the end of it. But the middle part really is where all the low-paying assembly jobs go, and how India should probably move beyond that and move to the ends. But Professor Lamba, I have to come to you. Before we get any further with this discussion, I'm often curious as a writer myself, how does it work when two folks decide to work on one book? Are the writing responsibilities divided? Is there more input from one side and more writing by the other? Is perhaps one of you the better writer and perhaps devoting a lot more time to put pen on paper? If you could just help us understand how the dynamics between you and Dr. Rajan were when it came to actually writing this book.
I think once the khichdi is made, it's hard to understand, which components came first or later. But I think for us, it was beneficial that we knew each other for a fairly long time.
Right.
I mean, for me particularly, like when you kind of, there's a different stages of a relationship. When you go from idolizing someone to kind of treating them like, a colleague and then a co-author, right? So there's a whole journey. But luckily for me, the journey was having known him for quite a while. Since 2013, I worked with him and he was the chief economic advisor and I was a PhD student. And then he went on to Mumbai to become the RBI governor. I went back to finish my PhD. So I've known him since then and we've been in touch. And so it was, after all these discussions and getting sort of familiar with, someone who you idolize and treating them as a normal person, I think it was during COVID when we started writing op-eds, like concretely. That was like kind of, I would say that the start of a co-authorship. And I think at that point, it was back and forth. Like, sometimes I would write the first draft, sometimes Raghu would write the first draft. I think it took me a while to criticize him, which he demanded. So, so if he wrote something and I didn't agree with it, he kind of, it took me a while to kind of say, no, this is not okay. So that was a certain period of time. But I think by the time we got to writing the book, we had a pretty good camaraderie of writing. And so some stuff he wrote first, some stuff I wrote first. I think one thing that in retrospect I value a lot that Raghu insisted from the very beginning was that I was afraid the book was going to be too technical. And Raghu insisted that the book shouldn't be too, it should be too dumbed down either.
Okay.
So we had to kind of hit this sweet spot. And I think that was a lot of fun and also a lot of hard work in the sense that we agreed that we would write the first draft almost as if we are talking to each other. And then we would simplify it rather than going the other way around because we wanted to be very careful that the economics shouldn't suffer even though the accessibility should be as high as possible.
So both of you went through every draft together.
Absolutely,
at the same time. You all did not divide responsibilities among yourselves.
I mean, the responsibilities were divided, but we went back and forth on whatever the other person wrote. So.
All right. In fact, one of the most eye-catching parts of the book to me was that little story at the beginning about this business school in the future. and the person who's visiting it, the professor, he actually starts off his journey in the school back in the 2020s, where we are today, and how much has changed, making a very strong case for export of services, Dr. Rajan. And it's something that you write off with so much passion too. And even as we're discussing India's industrial future and adding value to it, everyone is still talking, and you're a strong proponent of how our services are probably one of our bigger assets.
No, absolutely. Just to carry that forward, that theme that Rohit mentioned, we were very much about examples which people could touch and feel. And so the book is full of them, because we're trying to say, look, there's the economic aspect, and then there's the practical aspect, and the two weave together. And so we try and make economic arguments, but in as friendly a language as we can, because we want many people to read this. We want to pose an alternative vision of India.
Right.
Both economic, but also political and social. And we're saying this is a worthwhile vision to fight for, because this is something that if we can achieve, does so many things, including hopefully making us rich before we get old.
Absolutely.
But on the, I spent, my school was very nice to me. Harvard was very nice to me. I spent a quarter every year at Harvard Business School. And Shrikant Datta sort of told me to go look at their new classroom. And, the new classroom is a classroom where people will appear in pictures on the wall.
Right.
And you have a faculty member there teaching. A lot of Indian faculty members at Harvard. So from that to the example in the introduction was just a step forward, and saying, okay, let's think about this 5 years forward. And let's think about those Indian faculty members, not at HBS, but at WIMWI, which actually, for those of you from Ahmedabad will realize that's an acronym for the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
And saying, what if Ahmedabad taught the world? And, the technology exists. We can just fancy it up a little bit. That's what we do in the book. But the capability to do that, to run an HBS from Ahmedabad, is there. We just need to think about all our resources across the world and bring them together. Can we bring back those professors who teach everybody at HBS? We don't need to bring them all back. Let's bring a few back.
Do we need the VR sets too? Is that on the table?
Well, that'll come. That'll come.
It's not too far distant.
The Oculus is there, or versions of that. But really, we have to think big. We have to think of how we can leap. And what we're trying to say is that technology is different today. This was not possible 15 years ago. You could not export services. Today, I was talking to a gentleman at a hospital in Chennai who's running this really fancy equipment. I won't mention names because but he was Googled by some guy in Chile who said, I need this kind of operation. I know you've done research on this because I've seen your papers, and I want to know whether I can get it done.
Right.
And so that's what the connectivity that happens today. Somebody in Chile can find out the doctor who's done research on it and who runs a facility in India, and he can come and get treated. And he's been treated for 2 years, is free of, he was a cancer patient. Absolutely. But that's the kind of service which we can do today. Wasn't possible. How would you know where to look in the first place 15 years ago? There's no internet. There was no way of finding out who does what where across the globe. Today we can. And we can provide these services, part physical, part virtual. And we need to think of how we can do this in a much more effective way. Can we keep those high-quality cancer doctors in India serving Indian patients, which they do, but also serving the world?
Right.
How do we figure out how to do that and leapfrog without having to go through the stage of everyone having to do low-skilled assembly, then moving up steadily.
And that's a big statement that both you gentlemen make in the book, that despite India being a manufacturing giant, a manufacturing heavyweight, wanting to compete with the likes of China in the not-so-distant future, hopefully, there is so much more that we can do. And you also brilliantly examine these aspects with case studies as well, like the ID case study or the lens cart one. So it's not that it's a vision too far in the future. We've already been there. We've done that, Professor Lamba. And that, I think, is a very critical aspect of your writing as well, that there are cases to look back on, and there is a template that we can work with.
I think sometimes people get this image, not everyone is going to be a professor, not everybody is going to be a doctor, which I think is a fair question. I think the first kind of cut to case studies and the data, what we propose is that there are broadly two kinds of services of the future, of the present actually, and definitely of the future, that are globalizing and becoming part of global value chains. One is what Raghu already described, which we categorize in the book as direct services. Right? A doctor sitting in Chennai providing advice to people in Chile or in the UK, our financial consultants, our IT services to a large extent. You can categorize them as direct services. 20 years ago, the word service, when we said what we say in the book, what would have come to your mind would be, somebody giving a haircut somewhere.
Right.
And what is interesting about a haircut is that it is stored in space and time. Okay, it's very difficult for you to store a haircut or to give a haircut to somebody sitting in Chile. Maybe it will be possible 20 years from now.
Who knows?
But there are various kinds of direct services now that are neither stored in space or time, and we kind of elaborate this quite a bit in the book.
You mean localized?
Localized, exactly. Localized in time and space. But there's a whole another set of services, both the case studies that you mentioned, which we call services embedded in manufacturing, or even more broadly, this space at the intersection of services and manufacturing, which is already becoming huge and is going to become even bigger in the future. So when you consume a product, for example, you buy a car, this is what economists call a final product, right? You went to a market and bought a car. But what all went into making that car is basically a host of what economists call intermediate goods, okay? And so the car of today is not kind of the car of the past which Henry Ford had thought of the large assembly line with thousands of workers working around the assembly line. The example we give in the book, for instance, is that the electric cars of today, cutting-edge cars like Tesla, for example, have something like 40 to 50 million lines of code written into them. So very important intermediate good into a final product that you're consuming, which is a manufactured good, is actually services. These are services embedded into a final manufacturing good, which you're very good at. So even if so you need to broaden the horizon of what is actually considered manufacturing, what is actually considered services. For example, we are trying the Micron example that you gave. Fabrication is one aspect of chip making. A very prominent, important aspect of chip making is chip design. Where is the chip conceptualized? According to various estimates, 20% of chip design is already happening in India. We just don't hold the intellectual property of it. We are designing it for other companies based in the US. So what we are trying to argue is that even in this sort of large space of services embedded in manufacturing, we have a head start. Now, the example of ID Fresh that we have in the introduction that you give is a very nice example where manufacturing is driven by an idea in services.
Yes.
Right? PC Mustafa is an incredible story of a man who fails sixth grade. Is the son of a ginger root laborer. He kind of fails sixth class, goes back to work with his father, and Matthew Sir, one of his teachers in Kerala, comes and tells him, "Hey, come back, try again." And he tries and tries, succeeds. And then eventually becomes an engineer, and then works abroad, comes back to India to start a company, and he realizes that there is a big need for fresh idli batter. And he starts a company around it, like all entrepreneurs will tell you ex post that they saw an opportunity that nobody else saw. But he then soon realizes that this service that he wants to offer, he has to manufacture it himself. So what you're seeing here with ID Fresh is that they're providing a service, and there are lots of logistics now around just being able to provide fresh idli batter every morning to all the stores in Bangalore, in Chennai, and so on. Lenscart, the example that we give, which you must have seen Lenscart stores all around the city, is a service, right? You're trying to sell glasses to Indians, and what P.H. Bansal, the CEO of Lenscart, told us is that there is a huge opportunity because so many Indians don't even know that they have an eye problem. And the market for glasses in India is going to just increase over the years. So he saw that as an opportunity. But he soon realized that it doesn't make sense for him to have the glass manufactured elsewhere. If you go to an optometrist in your locality, they probably sell 8 to 10 glasses. He wanted to sell 100, 200 glasses per store every day. So he starts manufacturing. But when he starts manufacturing, he told us that there was no option but to go to China because, in his words, there are entire townships in China making glasses. But as his industry develops and he understands this space between services and manufacturing, he starts manufacturing in India. And now they have a big factory in Gurgaon. They're setting up a big factory, another big factory in Rajasthan, and they're actually going global.
But this is where I think the point about customized versus commodity, that why they can do manufacturing in India is because they're doing customized manufacturing. With a lot more engineering embedded into the manufacturing of so many varieties, so many. And he says, commodity manufacturing, forget about it. It's going to be China.
Absolutely.
But when you come to more customized engineered goods, our jugaad comes in. So, I mean, if you think about the book more broadly, it's saying, let's look to our comparative advantage.
Absolutely.
Let's not just blindly say this is the only way to go. There are alternatives.
Playing to our strengths is a recurring theme in the book, and I completely acknowledge that. But Dr. Rajan, I can't quite help but ask you, given the fact that you just brought up China, there is so much talk today about leveraging India's strength in the light of the world's China plus one policy. And there's been so much talk about how this is an advantage that we just can't, let go of. Do you think there's enough jugaad being added to such an outlook? Do you think ingenuity, innovation, thinking out of the box, services, value-added services to a manufacturing activity, do you think there's enough of that, or are we still, as a country, as an economy, across states, global investor summits are happening even as we speak. Do you still think there's just way too much focus on manufacturing, especially in the light of the China plus one policy, and not so much on value-added manufacturing?
Right. When you look at the China plus one, we should be getting far more manufacturing than we are. We are not attracting enough of the China plus one. That should come in as a matter of course. You don't have to bribe them. They want more security, and we are a big economy ourselves. So producing for the domestic market is part of the attraction. That should be coming. Unfortunately, when you look at the numbers, it's not as salient as one might think. Mexico attracting lots, Vietnam attracting lots, India much less than it should be. So by all means, let's make the playing field attractive. Tomorrow's investment summit in Chennai is about trying to say, here are the various things we're doing to make it attractive. But that means, for example, assure investors that you'll get high quality labor, that you will have a trained labor force that they can employ. Assure them ease of access to land, to utilities, to power, to all the things that they need.
Would you then suggest that the lack of those assurances, at least in good measure, is a big part of the reason as to why there's not enough coming our way by way of China plus one?
I think we have to deal with some of our old failings, which is we change policy every 3 months. And guys coming in are putting in a factory for 30 years. If you change the tariffs here, you change the taxation there, et cetera, they worry. And if it's done because they become a competitive threat, they worry even more. So we need to go back to the basics that we've always known about, that we need to create a clear understanding for investors. This is what it will look like. Yes, of course, there will be changes, but we'll take you into confidence when we're discussing those changes. More than subsidies and so on, what they want is clarity of policy. Because there's a lot that is attractive about India, including the large domestic market, but also a labor force. So if we can resolve some of these difficulties, there's no reason why we shouldn't get much more manufacturing. Of course, we have a huge pool of engineers. And that should be an attraction, not just, we have moderately skilled labor, but we have this engineering group. And I think that if we focus on that, that should be fine. What we are worried about more is the excessive subsidization. If you put together everything that the state governments, the central government, everybody's offering, then you have to ask, what am I getting in return? So that's why the Micron example is very important in the book, because here's a factory which is going to produce, not logic chips, but memory chips, which, is in the caste system of chips is perhaps
at the low end.
Lower in terms of what you would aim for as if you wanted to become an intellectual powerhouse. We pay, the entire investment is $2.7 billion. The central government and the state of Gujarat are picking up $2 billion. For what? For 5,000 jobs, which, this is not about R&D being done there. This is about jobs in actually putting those chips together. My sense is that if we look at this carefully, spending over 1/3 of the central government's higher education budget equivalent in subsidizing a factory doesn't make that much sense.
Absolutely.
So I would say, again, the whole tariff and subsidy policy assumes a lot of knowledge and prescience on the part of government on these are the industries which will be really valuable and those won't. I don't see any sort of public discussion on how they choose. Why this industry, not that? And does it make more sense for me to get this in? Is it part of a stepping stone towards something else? I don't see any discussion of all that. So pending all that, I would say, let's be a little careful.
Careful. And Professor Lamba, would you happen to think of an industry or a company or a sector that's probably playing the game right, as opposed to heavy subsidization benefiting 5,000 odd employees? In stark contrast, could you think of an example or two for the benefit of our audiences?
I mean, one of the examples we give in the book is of an industry that is booming. To the best of our knowledge, not with any government help, is what's called the Global Capability Centers.
Yes.
According to NASSCOM, actually, they're kind of valued right now around $46 billion, generating about 1.7 million jobs. Firms like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Walmart have their biggest offices outside the US in Bangalore.
10% in Tamil Nadu.
And so I was going to say, what
Yes.
the minister told us was that actually they're coming in large numbers actually in Tamil Nadu
Most
now.
recently, the likes of Hitachi, UPS
Exactly.
have all opened global
and
capability
they're
centers.
producing 10,000 jobs a month. And so, again, not to say that everybody is going to be in India or even in Bangalore or Chennai is going to be employed in global capability centers, but here is a success story. HSBC India actually has done very good case studies showing how these are forming a very significant part of managing India's current account deficit, the flows that are coming in because of these global capability centers. And when you look at the math, it's kind of obvious why they're coming, right? You take one of my students graduating from undergrad, and they want to work in, let's say in New York, you have to pay them $150K, $150,000 at the minimum to compete in the labor market. The same, basically the same talent, with you having to adjust to time zones, you can hire in Chennai or Bangalore at $40K or $50,000. The labor arbitrage is simply staggering. Right? So it makes sense that this industry is coming in large numbers to India because of our talent pool, because of English language, and so on. Sure. So here is, you asked for an example, here is a very successful example,
Absolutely.
which hasn't actually received much attention from government at all.
Right. And in fact, the book does make ample mention of human capital as well, in terms of being a very valuable part of the investment chain when it goes into any investment concerning manufacturing.
But just on amplifying this point, we need many more of our graduates to be of the quality that, let me plug Krea, of the quality that Krea graduates are, because they become instantly employable. And so we need, we mentioned the survey from WeBox, which looks at graduates and says 50% of Indian graduates are unemployable.
Yes.
They don't have the skills to get a job. And that's a really damning sort of situation, right? You have all these people who spend 15, 18 years in schools and higher education, and they can't get a job. And so they end up, writing exam after exam, hoping that at some point, until they superannuate from giving civil service exams, they can't actually even qualify because they're too old. That is a waste of talent. How do we upgrade from where they are right now to where they can get those GCC jobs. And how do we get 10 times the number of GCC jobs rather than the number that we have right now?
In fact, yeah, that's a question on everyone's mind. But while I have you here, I can't quite help but ask you, a lot of what we're talking about also has, it also has ties linked with just how the global economic climate pans out, especially in these times that we find ourselves in. So given that the Fed is being watched with a close eye and the jury is out, will they, won't they cut rates? I think most recently some reports suggested that they may continue to hold on to high rates for a while before they choose to cut them. What is your outlook on rate cuts by the Fed? Do you suppose it could happen?
It'll take longer than the markets expect. I think what we've seen is substantial disinflation on the goods side. I think services disinflation is tapering off. Of course, we've been surprised by all the data over the last year, and I've been reminded of that every time by the Indian press. You said this, what happened?
Right.
But what we're seeing is that disinflation from the supply chains reestablishing, from demand for goods going down. It had just peaked, you couldn't go to a gym, so you ordered a Peloton, and that was across the board. So the demand for Pelotons went through the roof. So all that has fallen off. And so, but the goods disinflation is also tapering, while services is still high because labor market is really, really tight. We just saw yesterday's labor market numbers. In this kind of tight situation, it's unlikely the Fed will take a gamble by cutting rates soon.
Right.
It'll wait till it sees inflation come down to much closer to the target. And I don't think that's going to happen in a jiffy.
In a jiffy. What does that mean for India, though, in terms of our strategy moving forward? If the Fed is going to take as much time as it needs to cut rates, what do you suppose the strategy for India would be going forward?
I think India, Raghu spoke of it. I think India should just wait and watch, like what the Fed does with respect to it. I think broadly, what we say in the book also, our monetary policy is doing broadly fine. I think what is really holding, we think in the book back is more structural reforms. Like that, why should they be willing to come to India? For example, from the perspective of government documents that are in the public domain, we know that there is about a marginal problem, about 8 to 11%. This is government's own data, for other firms to come and invest in India. This is how the government rationalizes, for example,
8 to 10% cost disadvantage.
Cost disadvantage of firms coming to India. So it's not at this point. Obviously this could change in the future depending on what the Fed does and the global climate. At this point, that's not really the binding constraint as far as growth of industry is concerned in India. What it really is that can we actually simplify this both at the level of infrastructure, human capital, talent pool, and make it attractive for people to come to India.
Right. Gentlemen, coming back to the book for just a bit, even as we discuss economic issues in India and around the world, you make ample mention of how progress from an economic perspective, of course, is also so dependent on socio-political factors that prevail in the country. You talk about how better education, better awareness, tolerance is something that plays a very critical role. And I know for a fact that you speak about this on many occasions as well, especially in the past. Addressing all of these issues in a book about India's economic future, especially given the environment we're in, you also make mention of the fact that the Indian establishment does not like too much criticism. Did you face any challenges, Dr. Rajan, when it came to how much of this should we delve into, while how much of the economics should we simply stick to talking about?
Well, I think what we're trying to say, and what I've been saying for quite some time, is the economics and the politics are linked.
Absolutely.
They're not two dissociated things. And so you have to ask yourself, are we going to the right politics for the economics we need? And maybe 20 years ago, I would have said, yeah, maybe we are going towards the right politics. We were a democracy too early. We still need, to make the trains run on time, we need discipline, we need a heavy hand as we catch up. Today, I think it's exactly the wrong direction. That, in fact, we need more democracy. We need to protect creativity, ideas, fresh thinking. And fresh thinking often, especially radical thinking, one of the things we keep emphasizing in the book is incremental innovation will not cut it as much going forward. We need radical innovation. Instead of doing generics, finding a different way of manufacturing the generic pharmaceutical, those rents are dissipating. We need to have the original product. We need to innovate new pharmaceuticals. That requires R&D. That requires challenging the status quo and saying, I don't believe the theories the existing theories of these drugs. I'm going to invent a new drug. I'm going to invent a new product. That's where the value added is. You talked about the smile curve. What is the smile curve? It's how much value added happens at each stage of the production process. Turns out enormous value added in the intellectualization, conceptualization, product design. That's early on. If we capture that, chip design, if we are the Qualcomms and the NVIDIAs of the world, we don't need to manufacture any chips. We have enormous value from that. Apple doesn't manufacture anything since 2004, worth $3 trillion. Foxconn does all Apple's manufacturing, worth $50 billion, 1/60th. Ideas is where the value is. Manufacturing no longer, especially low-skilled manufacturing, is not where the value is. If we believe that, how do we generate ideas? There's a surefire enabler of ideas. That's democracy, that's debate, that's free speech. To curb that at this point is going in the exact wrong direction for this country. And that's why we keep saying we got to emphasize the fact that the two are linked.
Right.
That at this stage, to give up on our democracy is a bad idea.
A quick follow-up, though. You did make mention in the book that perhaps India should have had a heavy hand early on. We perhaps got democracy too soon for our own good. You make mention of that, yeah. And you're repeating it now as well in terms of maybe a heavy hand back then would have helped. So many would also argue, hey, better late than never.
No, so let me even back off from saying that. I just threw it out as a possibility. You could get the wrong dictator. You could get a dictator who does crazy things. There are plenty of them around, right? Let's be careful about wanting something. Once you get it, you may not like it. The beauty about democracy is you can throw out the person you don't like. Mm-hmm. The problem with an authoritarian structure is you're stuck, no matter how bad they are. Everybody keeps thinking of Lee Kuan Yew as the dictator they would want. But what if you got Mobutu Sese Seko? And how do we know we don't, we're not in the process of getting one like that?
Right.
Authoritarian structures have a great volatility embedded in them. Mm-hmm. You have to hope and pray that not only do you get the right person, but they stay right. They don't change. And people have a habit of changing once they have a lot of power.
They do, don't they? Professor Lamba, even as we talk about how socio-economic factors and socio-political factors rather play such a crucial role towards economic futures, how much of this is linked today to where we are as a country and where we're heading to? Do you think there's light at the end of the horizon given the emphasis, like Professor Rajan says, about democracy, democratic ideals, free speech, free thinking? In the context of all of this, what does the future hold for you in terms of where we're heading to for our economic well-being?
I mean, we are largely optimistic, about both in the book and in our hopes. I wouldn't use the word predictions because, economists are... Raghu is an exception, but economists are really notorious to be bad at predictions. But yeah, at least our hope is very positive. I think democracy, Raghu said, we always preface it by saying you can have a fairly, informed academic argument about whether India democratized too early. And I think if you look at what we say in the book is that if you look at historically, not just India, or historically, especially with the US and UK, what we see is that these countries, it's really a misnomer to say the US became a democracy in 1776. If you look at, they gradually grew over time, and they also gave freedom to their people over time. I mean, US doesn't give universal adult franchise till the 1930s, I think. Some of the European countries gave women the right to vote in the 1970s.
Yes.
Right? So what is remarkable about India is that it was a consistent and poor democracy. It is an outlier in that sense. So what we are trying to say is that there is definitely a link between getting the right kind of authoritarianism, and economic growth. It's not obvious. Counterfactuals are interesting for an academic debate, but we do like to put this argument, and especially the third part of the book that we strongly encourage you to read, that at this stage now, we do try to make a link. And I think it's also, every country has its own temperament. India has its own temperament. One should view India as some kind of United States of Europe when you think of different languages. To hold all of this together, you need some kind of pressure valve, which we wrote in one of our articles. And the pressure valve has to be to release the pressure valve is what I mean, is democracy. What you see happening in Manipur right now, I come from the state of Jammu and Kashmir, you need some kind of social mediation to be able to address all these, famously as Naipaul said, million mutinies. And I think that's worked very well for India. Going forward, we do think that, for example, we put this argument in the book that India is going through a massive jobs crisis, right? How do you let that argument be communicated to the people and it become kind of the lifeblood of political economy around you? So what do I mean by that? If you look at, there's some media people here. If you listen to media, you won't get a sense that there is a job crisis in India. That's in terms of the number of pages that it is acquiring, the number of debates that it's part of. So to do that, we don't see any other recourse than democracy, that how can this voice now be communicated so it actually becomes from a social to a political problem that can then be managed, right? So our only hope, we think, is democracy. And this is very important for economics going forward, because we must not be prisoners of our own instruments. We must not believe that the only thing we can ask the state is greater reservations in jobs and freebies, right? The argument has to go beyond that. And I think all of us sitting here have a very important role to play in it.
I'm glad you bring up freebies, because I was going to come to that in just a bit. Or like Mr. Parinavel Tyagarajan himself says, not freebies, but social spending. I think that's the term that we ought to use. But we'll come to that in a bit. But there's one thing everyone's talking about, especially with the union budget merely or less than a month away. It's bringing down the fiscal deficit. That's something that has occupied a lot of discourse. What is your take? Is there a way to do it? What's that way going to be like?
It's called less spending, more revenues.
All right.
That's how you bring down a deficit. No, we certainly had to spend during the pandemic.
Yes.
And deficits blew out a little more, or deficit reduction was postponed. We certainly do need to get it back. One of the problems with keeping inflation moderate is that you can't inflate away your debt. And historically, that used to be the way we used to manage it, by having high rates of inflation, and the poor middle class, which used to hold the government debt either directly or indirectly, used to pay the price.
Right.
Now with inflation within the band, you can't do that. And so you actually have to focus on trying to keep the deficit on a more moderate scale. So it has to be done over time. I don't think that's it's going to be impossible. I think it can be done. It just needs a will and a focus on what kind of spending you really want to do, and what kind you think is more frivolous.
What kind of a timeline do you foresee in its eventual happening?
It depends on the will. My sense is, post-elections, we will have a government which has a 5-year horizon, and it has to plan over that 5 years how it brings it to a reasonable level. And of course, it's both the states and the central government, and they have to plan together.
You speak about elections, and every election season, in fact, multiple states went to the polls very recently. There's always this talk about freebies and social spending. Not so much as an election plank, but also by way of policy itself. The state of Tamil Nadu, in fact, gets a whole lot of uncharitable publicity when it comes to social spending here, with critics saying that it's making people lazy. It is a lot of state spending that happens. Several proponents of social spending keep correcting that perception, pointing to Europe and displaying how social spending is actually a very critical part of how the economies there work. What is your take on that? You brought it up just the last time around. Freebies or social spending, whichever term you'd like to use. I would assume it helps. But if you could just help break it down to critics of it, or people who perhaps criticize with reductionist ideas, if you could help us understand why they're important.
I mean, we talk about it in the book, and I brought it up as the limitation of conversation between the polity and the citizenry, right? Not so much that this is wasteful or so on. Like, what can a citizen ask the government beyond just a transfer of money, right? I think that conversation needs to be broadened significantly. Tamil Nadu has one of the greatest social indicators in the country, right? Whether in terms of education, maternal health, and so on. That's not just because of transfers before the elections. That's because public services in this state are provided in a very efficient way historically, and they have been, and government after government has invested in them. So if you compare, for example, levels of malnutrition in children in Kerala and Tamil Nadu versus Bihar and UP, it's a matter of grave concern. This is not being solved by spending cash, but actually investing in institutions that then address these challenges. So absolutely, we take the position in the book that social spending is very important, simply because of the unequal way in which the country has grown, even especially in the last 10 years. So nobody, I think, no right economist would say that social spending is actually not important. In fact, we have a whole section, chapter 10 in the book, called Addressing Inequality, where we actually make the case that we should start thinking systematically about rationalizing a lot of the subsidies that seem to be wasteful. To give you an example, India's fertilizer subsidy in the last year's union budget was 2.25 lakh crores. That's more than twice the entire education, primary and higher education budget of the central government for the year. That was 1.05 lakh crores. That's your primary, secondary, tertiary, and higher education budget from the central government, and 2.25 lakh crores of, not that we shouldn't be given fertilizer subsidy, but what is the country spending on? What we do caution against is what we call competitive populism. Right? The idea that somehow it becomes a way for politicians to communicate with the citizenry that this is the way we are going to make things attractive for you. That's a concern, and I think that's kind of is already embedded in your earlier question to Raghu about fiscal deficits and so on. So, how do we put checks and balances as citizens and as media, as intellectuals on the polity, not to indulge beyond a point in competitive populism? Rather than spending this social spending to be actually on quality investments rather than pure transfers.
Right. To give you one quick example, Tamil Nadu, actually Pondicherry and then Tamil Nadu were one of the earliest states to have the midday meal scheme. And that's a tremendous scheme.
And now Tamil Nadu has free breakfast as well for everybody.
Yeah, so, but let's look at the midday meal scheme. Fantastic scheme to increase the nutritional levels of the kids, but also to bring kids into school. Parents send their kids to school because they'd get the meal. And in the process, they get educated also.
Sure.
So the dropout rate falls when you have the midday meal scheme. So that's an example where you really, through social spending, helping invest in some of the poorer segments of society. Right. So the more targeted it is, the better it is. And the more it performs these various other functions of, making our kids better, nutrition and bringing them to school, fantastic. There are places where, just giving more simply because the voter demands it. That's when it gets to the point where, should I be using this for, better healthcare systems, or should I be just giving it out like that? That's when the question starts becoming more point.
I mean, if you look at the recent election coverage, right? Like if you go in most media houses that went to the ground in Madhya Pradesh, in Rajasthan, etc., you'd see what is it that on a day-to-day basis, people, it's jobs, education of their children, healthcare, and I think what we're trying to say is that what happens is that there is a demand deflection when the only conversation you and I are having, not just as voters, but as people who are covering elections and so on, is just limited to this spending, rather than about issues that really are affecting people.
In fact, I was going to ask you, is there a perception problem? The very fact that most sections of the media till this day continue to call social spending freebies, is that the problem really?
So we have to be more careful about what we define. So my political opponents only does freebies while I do social spending, and he'd say the same thing of me. But the point is, in a contained and targeted way, you can make the case for a lot of these transfers to be social spending. But in an uncontained, untargeted way, it becomes more election freebies. I can tell you I've had numerous experiences, both in government and outside, of meeting with high politicians who say, I promised this during the election, how do I actually make it happen? Because I have no money to do any actual spending.
Right.
Because it's all been promised in these giveaways.
But who decides what's contained, what's not contained? Who draws that line?
Well, that's responsible politics, right, ultimately. And the voter has to see, does this make any sense?
Right.
These guys are promising the moon. If they promise the moon, what happens to, roads, healthcare, education, all the other stuff they have to spend on? I think that the voter ultimately has to be the decider, because it can't be some independent body. I've toyed with the idea. I've proposed. I wrote a letter to the Election Commission saying maybe they should opine on this. But I in hindsight, I think maybe they shouldn't. Maybe the voter should. But how do you get the voter to make a more learned decision? And that's where the intelligentsia, the press, has to sort of point out, this is simply unaffordable, and we will spend the next 5 years sort of regretting the promises that were made.
Right. You bring up the press, and I can't quite help by asking you right now, the book does make mention about how recent discourse has witnessed how when there is criticism over an aspect of governance, especially when it's to do with economics, what you end up seeing in the press is a very different picture in terms of what the establishment perhaps wants you to see in order to cover up for what you may mention are inadequacies. How problematic is this practice? The propaganda game is no doubt a very crucial and powerful aspect of government, of electoral governments in terms of wanting to stay elected and come back to power. How harmful and impactful is this to good economics?
Let me not make the mistakes that is made by them, and let's stick to some facts on which we actually have data, right? So one thing we do say in the book, for example, and I'll try to get your question through that example, is COVID, right? So what happens when you first disseminate the wrong information and then buy the wrong information yourself as a policymaker, right? So we grossly undercounted deaths in the first wave, like largely almost every kind of scientist, international journals have documented that. If you look at the WHO studies on this, you look at Lancet studies on this, you can debate, what is the level of error in their estimations. But, even the most charitable study says we undercounted deaths by orders of magnitude, right? So what happens when you do that, right? So you may be doing that for a propaganda reason or a political reason or whatever the motivation may be. What happens then is that then a laziness creeps in that Indians are special. That somehow, this is the reason why we didn't see many deaths. And what we try to argue in the book is that a large part of the reason why we had a ruthless second wave is because we dismantled both physical and intellectual infrastructure that we had rightfully built during the first wave, because we thought that, well, Indians are not dying because of COVID. And so what happened in the second wave was significantly more severe, that's our hypothesis, than it would have been otherwise. And so this is just one example of when you are actually propagating the wrong data. You yourself, policymakers themselves, and this comes from we give an example, this comes right from the top actually, this kind of, and then you start having election rallies and you start having Kumbh Melas, so because you think that all is okay. More specifically when it comes to economic data, for example, and this again, there are two issues, right? Measurability and interpretability. If you don't release economic data, right, you're kind of doing policy making in the dark, right? So consumption data hasn't been released since 2017. We seem to be in no mood to have the census data for some reason. There's lots of debates going around the GDP data, and what happens, and then there is this unemployment data that we are releasing, which is, what it is, but somehow a lot of this is not squaring up with the lived reality of our own people. To give you an example, even if, for example, we say that unemployment is, let's say, 3%, right? So first of all, is it really squaring with the lived reality of our people? And second, is interpretation, right? So as the economists, we need to inform the people about disguised unemployment. What does that mean? India has massive amounts of disguised unemployment. So if 2 people are enough to till a field and there's 7 people working on it, the productivity per person is significantly lower than, for example, in China.
Right.
If 2 people are enough to give you coffee behind a Starbucks counter, but there's 6 people standing behind the counter, that is disguised unemployment. So both in terms of measuring data and in terms of interpreting data, this is the job of measuring data is the job of the government, interpreting the job of the media. These are 2 case studies I'm giving you. If you're communicating arguments in a wrong way, forget about all the other propaganda, you will actually make policy in the dark.
Absolutely. Moving on from data and communication to government capex, do you think there's a case for it to continue, to go higher perhaps? What's your take?
Well, we don't have the budgetary room to keep at the pace we had in the first 2 quarters of this year, so we will have to slow down. The nice thing about construction is there's plenty of it for a while. Of course, you don't want to become overly dependent on it. China became overly dependent on construction and accounted for 30% of GDP. And that becomes a problem when you've built out much of what you need to build out. And there's then overbuilding. The amount of square footage of real estate per family in China now is far beyond what they can afford income-wise.
Right.
And so they have oversupply in housing. So we have to be careful. But I think there is ways to go still for India. So construction would be good. But what is important across is private investment has to pick up. We've been reliant on public investment, and the government has stepped up and is doing a good job on public infrastructure investment. But we need much more private investment. And ever since my time at the RBI, we've been puzzling over why private investment is so subdued. Right from the global financial crisis, we've had really low levels of private investment. And even with all the Josh at this point, private investment is still not picking up, except in a few cases like cement and some
Have you
else.
gotten around to figuring out why that may be the case?
Well, if you look at capacity utilization, we're still not at very high levels of capacity utilization. So either our productivity is growing much faster for some reason, or somehow the animal spirits, the business person talks in public a different language from what they actually do in
Vote
private.
with their money. Yeah.
Absolutely. Before I end, I have to get your gentleman's take on Indian growth. That's one of the more favorite talking points that everyone has, an opinion on. People keep projecting it. There are reports that suggest Indian GDP may be timely, given the fact, given the NSO projections. What is your take, Professor Lamba? Can I start with you?
I think people can have let me take a slightly long-term view, right? So the Prime Minister has said, which is a beautiful ambition, that by 2047, what we are calling now popularly as Amrit Kal, that we should become if nothing else, Viksit Bharat, I think, would mean a developed country, but let's say a more realistically a middle-income country. But India today is at $2,500 GDP. China is around $13,000. Korea is around $35,000. If we have 24 years to go, I think some people think India's growth potential is 6%. Let's say it's 7% and we grow our population by 1%, which is probably an underestimate. Our growth potential, GDP per capita potential, comes down to around 6%. At 6%, we will double our GDP in 12 years. So in 24 years, which is we'll be at $10,000. We won't even be where China is today, right? So while I think we should laudably celebrate a 7% growth rate, it is way below both our ambition and what the growth rate needs to be to provide jobs for the tens of millions of people joining labor force every year. So, the argument that we are writing in the book, and again coming back to this sort of supply chain and smile curve and so on, is our ambition needs to be much, much bigger if we are actually serious about putting action to that ambition and getting to about $12,000 to $15,000 GDP by 2047.
All right. Dr. Rajan, I know for a fact that the NSO releasing advanced estimates means that there are suggestions that GDP growth will be timely this time around. What is your take? Do you think there is enough reason to feel okay about it? Can we do more?
I think the point Rohit is making is, let's not get entrapped in this, what's next quarter, what's the last quarter. Take growth over a period of time. What's to be really happy about is we grew 6% for 25 years. Great. Very few countries have done that. A few have, South Korea, China, but many haven't. That's something to be proud of. Take growth over the last 4 years, 4%. Not so great, but we had the pandemic. So we are rebounding from that. That's the 7% growth that you see. We're still below the pre-pandemic trend. But what we need, and that's what Rohit wants to bring us back to, is we need 24 years of plus 6% per capita growth, not even overall growth, per capita growth. 7% overall growth if we grow 1% per capita, just to reach middle income. Let's not get complacent and say, 7%, we're the fastest growing country in the world. We're also the poorest country in the G20. Let's remember that. Poor countries need to grow much faster because they need to get to the point where they become rich enough before they grow old. 2047, 2050 is when we start growing old. Our demographic dividend is sort of played out by then. We have 24 years to make a difference. We have to start today.
All right.
We can't reach 2047 with 35% malnutrition. No developed country has that level of malnutrition. But those kids who are malnutrition today will be entering the labor force 20 years from now. So we have to remember, if we want to be a developed country then, we got to fix some of these problems today. And they're not the problems of we need a high-speed rail, etc. They're actually bread and butter problems we haven't solved since independence. And now we should say it's high time we actually solve them.
Right. So on that note, there's a whole long way to go. India may well be one of the fastest progressing countries, one of the quickest growing economies, but there's still a long way to go. And well, it's not just in manufacturing, it's not just in the strength of our industries, but there's a lot of human capital involved. The value addition that we bring to the kind of work we do could well be our trump card if we choose to play it. On that note, Professor Lamba, Professor Rajan, great speaking to you. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, to the authors of Breaking the Mold, Reimagining India's Economic Future. Gentlemen, thank you so very much. Thank you.
So the promise holds true. The evening has been really spectacular, more so than we expected. I would like to take this opportunity to now invite Mr. N. Ram, Director, the Hindu Group Publishing Private Limited, honestly who needs no introduction, for the closing remarks.
Thank you. It's been a very good conversation on a book that is eminently worth reading. I see there are some copies there. Those who don't have a copy, please buy one. What we are offered here is a look ahead, a visionary but reasoned and scholarly, and some would say radical look ahead for the Indian economy over a relatively ambitious time frame. The vision, as revealed in the introduction, is to deliver, quote, extraordinary well-being for all the people of India within a couple of decades. And this outcome shall I call it a near miracle, can be realized only if India can, quote, break the mold to follow a truly Indian way. I'm quoting from the introduction again. That's the central and unifying argument that makes the book, I think. It's a hugely, hugely demanding ask. Something like India being set a winning target of 401 on an exploding pitch against Rabada and company in the fourth innings at Newlands in Cape Town. Actually, they got an easy target and they made it well. To get away from cricket, which I think is one of Raghu's serious interests, or used to be, I like the division of the book into three parts. First, development an Indian way. Second, governance, capabilities and more. And finally, a robustly articulated, deceptively mild wrapping up featuring the wrong way, which is really after my heart. I'll come to that a little later. Breaking the Mold is a surprisingly accessible book. For a book that draws on data and scholarship in a comprehensive way. It works with I had a chat with Rohit before that, if I may call you Rohit. There's a clear theoretical construct here. And it brings into the analysis, quote, impressive knowledge of the global economic and technological trends, to quote from one of the blurbs at the back of the book. I personally don't like these three-liners. They are usually fulsome and pretentious, no disrespect meant to those who supplied them. A book should stand on its own, solitary and left to its own devices and defenses. But publishers seem to demand these blurbs, and that's marketing for you, don't blame the authors. The easy interweaving of the objective and the subjective, by which I mean the examples, the anecdotes, and other informal and personal touches you come across alongside the unifying argument, and the paucity of economist jargon are part of what makes breaking the mold really accessible to the general reader, surprisingly accessible, I would emphasize, for such a scholarly work dealing with based on within the framework of a theoretical construct. I don't know if Raghu and Rohit will agree, but I think the book is an ambitious essay in political economy within the economic framework that Raghu has been developing over the years, and Rohit, the economic theorist, has joined forces for him, and that was explained very well in this conversation. I don't wish to label this framework or the societal and political economy considerations and arguments that have over time come to play an increasingly significant role in, at least I know some of Raghu's work, his thinking. This becomes very clear and explicit, this possible change in perspective with the publication in 2020 of the third pillar, how markets and the state leave the community behind. I see Breaking the Mold, a work of two hands and two minds, and specifically part 2 as being a significant progression from the third pillar and associated journal articles and writings. I would like to return to the works of Amartya Sen on commodities, capabilities, and functionings, and on the relationship between expanding social opportunity and economic development, to see if there's any real convergence in the respective approaches to the key issues. India Economic Development and Social Opportunity by Jean Dress and Sen, published in 1995, immediately comes to mind. As for characterizing Raghu's ideological position, if you can call it that, let me quote the man himself answering a pointed question, a leading question, in an extended interview published in the Indian Express. Not the New Indian Express, but the Indian Express in another territory, December 18, 2023. And I quote, "Economically, everyone's left of center in India. Well, I'd be considered centrist to right of center. I think socially, I'm left of the center in the sense that I would like as liberal a social structure as we can possibly get. I do believe that inequality is a huge problem. Some of it is historical, some of it is new, and we need to deal with it." And that came through very clearly in the conversation. And of course, it's been elaborated in the book. I mentioned the conceit the wrong way in the final part of the book, which precedes the brief summing up. It's a reasoned, good-tempered, and serious exposition of an uncompromisingly secular and democratic position. It's in line with the ancient Indian philosophical tradition. We have a distinguished philosopher here, a professor of philosophy at Columbia University, Akil Bilgrami. So I'll make this reference. It's in line with the ancient Indian philosophical tradition of laying out your opponent's argument in a serious way and to best effect in order to rebut the fallacies and falsehoods in their argument and strengthen your own standpoint. I won't say more about this except that I loved reading The Wrong Way, which they call a conceit for which they make a needless apology in that section. Caveats. I think we need to get some teeth into the hard problems. Above all, the challenge of mass deprivation and inequality, not just poverty, but multiple deprivations. And I reckon that India has the largest mass of deprivations of any country in the world. We are quite developed in some respects, in several respects perhaps, but when it comes to deprivations, which can be clearly defined, whether it's income deprivation or educational deprivation, health deprivation, environmental deprivation, and so on, I think we certainly has the largest mass. There are some suggestions in the book on how to tackle this, but I think more attention needs to pay to this, and surely this is going to be taken up in future. I would personally like to see more on the question of inequality, that deal with it in their own way, in a theoretical way. And I mentioned building capabilities, providing social opportunity, and a very good critique of existing institutions and practices. But I think we need more attention to tackling inequality, which is not just an Indian problem. China has huge inequalities, despite being a socialist country, and I think it's one of the hard problems that need to be tackled along the development path. And the other hard problem, which is tangentially mentioned in the book, I think, is corruption. Corruption in India being pervasive, omnipresent, and diverse, covering every branch of the Indian state and every sector of the economy. And I have a question for Raghu, and I think it used to be said that if you dismantle the permit and license Raj, made it easier for economic units, entrepreneurs to function and flourish, corruption would come down or can be contained. Exactly the opposite has happened after liberalization. There must be many ways. I mean, it's a complex question, but how do we explain that? That post-liberalization, corruption, which is pervasive, omnipresent, and diverse, covering every branch of the economy and every branch of the state, has increased exponentially. I was one of those who investigated the Bofors scandal, $50 million, peanuts compared with the allegations made about current corrupt deals and so on. But it's also entrenched and pervasive, including in the public distribution system, everywhere. Is that an obstacle to economic development? Does it really hurt? That question, I think, needs to be tackled, and I would have liked a special chapter in the book or a section in one of the parts on that issue. Finally, I think there's some very interesting assessments of China's performance, many examples. But overall, the question is whether there's an underestimation of China's advances in the critical and advanced technologies. The economic journalist M.K. Venu, who takes issue with Raghu, specifically on this point, in a recent issue of The Wire, that's December 22nd, cites a study by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. It found that China has, quote, this will shock many of us, a stunning lead over Western democracies in 37 out of 44 critical and emerging technologies, and that the US often found itself in the second place despite its technological prowess and strong research base. I have no knowledge of the data here. I don't have access to the report. There's a Reuters report reporting this, which MK Venu cites. But I recently visited China for about 10 days, Beijing and Guangzhou, which is a canton, and visited Huawei, their university, and Tencent in Shenzhen. And it is certainly very, very impressive for, at least superficially speaking, what they are doing in AI and in various technological fields, as well as their media. So the question is whether I don't think the argument we underestimate the lead that China has, but in making the argument that democracy, space for creative ideas is vital to economic development and to well-being of the people, I think we need more robust evidence on how this has worked in China or has not worked in China. I don't know enough about it, but I think this article attracted my interest, and perhaps if the time permits, you could respond to it, or we could have a conversation later. But I really enjoyed reading the book. I've read most of it, and I'll read it again. I think it makes a very important argument. Whether you agree with the framework or not, it makes a very important argument. And I think India will be benefited if many of the recommendations and prescriptions given within this framework are implemented. Thank you.
We would like to invite Dr. Rajan, Dr. Lamba, and Mr. Ram to take a photograph with the books on the podium, please.